Welcome. This is a digital ACE project for Holex, and this is a recording of the session that took place this morning on 8th of June 2021, which is a session for English tutors to share good practice. So I'd like to start with a little quote from Joanna Reardon, who challenged a group of young girls to produce a robot for her. She had no limbs in 2012 and yet was working with technology using her mouth. And this was her comment: life is about living, and let's face it, technology is not just a way of life, it's a way of living. And I think in these times that really has come to the fore for a lot of us. And we kicked off this morning with talking about the changes that have happened and the impact it's had on the lives of our learners and of ourselves. One of the areas that we were focusing on was community. So obviously in isolation, how for many people growing as a community has been really important. The online community, that bringing a sense of belonging at times when we've perhaps been cut off from one another. And that's been true of our learners as well. So we were looking at activities which would enhance the cooperation between learners and their behaviour online. One of the aspects that we looked at was whether people were happy to be online and have their video showing or not, and the kind of ground rules that tutors have been developing to deal with that. So in some cases, learners have been not having their videos on, but are contributing to Jamboards or feeding back in other ways using the chat so that the tutor knows they're active. In other cases, tutors have been setting tasks which allowed learners to go away and be offline for some time and then come back to the class to share what they've been doing. In some cases, we've decided that we needed to upskill our learners so that they could take part. But in many cases, learners have been very happy to take on board the learning that's been offered to them, including the digital work. So part of the background obviously would be to keep everybody safe online, to promote well-being. And one of the people this morning was discussing the acronym HEART, which you'll see later as a resource on the Padlet. He has certain qualities such as well-being qualities that he has used each week to bring his learners some comfort and some ideas. And we've all been working with different resources towards well-being over the year. We discussed in here the need for staff also to keep an eye out for themselves and see how their working patterns is affecting their health and their well-being. And one person in particular mentioned that she had introduced sorry, I've lost the word for a moment. She had introduced classes where people could meditate, and she found that very helpful for herself, and also as a reminder that she needed to get out and take walks and see the countryside and do other things, which we all agreed with. We talked about communication briefly, the kind of routines that we might establish to keep people checking in. And we didn't spend a lot of time on communication, except to say that for some people, blended learning is the way to go, because they've really appreciated coming back into class, but can work well online. And one of our tutors is using BKSB very effectively in her teaching. So not just using the initial assessment and diagnostic assessment, but reinforcing the work that she's doing by directing learners to specific resources, which she highly recommended. We looked at collaboration, the way for us to work together as tutors, and how teamwork has become very important. How being proactive is important for us as colleagues. so that we don't miss out. You know, the sort of chats that we would normally have at work quite naturally are not available for us so much. And so making sure that we keep up to date with meetings and contacting each other is doubly important at the moment. Talking about learners who might need more than just a meet, we've been looking a little bit at different ways of keeping them going. At Kahoot games, where you could set a topic and then learners could put up their own opinions and make suggestions. About modelling answers, about learners coming together to proofread and work out what might be possible, perhaps working in a breakout room. That was a very possible way of going at the moment, with tutors just dipping in and out to see what was happening there. In addition, quite a few people had developed support behind the scenes. So it might be guides where learners can find out how to work the digital things, such as handing in assignments or even getting onto a meet. And quite a few places now are setting up a session or two early on so that people are equipped when they come into the class rather than playing catch up once they get there. And that saves us time when we're teaching, if people are up to speed when they start. In my own organisation, the LSA support is absolutely essential. Working with learners one-to-one and filling in gaps or helping to build confidence where it's needed. One of the reasons I put this quote on is that I think it's very important that we don't have busy work going on, even online, that we're selecting very carefully to reflect the needs of our learners and to be moving them on, helping them to progress. So that would take me on to the higher thinking skills. So these kind of questions, you know, what if this happened? What would you do if? The 5 W's, and continuing with why, going deeper, pushing learners to keep justifying or to analyze further their thoughts, not to give up at the, you know, a very surface level answer. And the sort of putting things into priority order, making choices, justifying why they make choices, the activities that they can do quite happily on screen, comparing photographs or comparing texts, gathering together pros and cons and grey areas, particularly realising that things aren't just black and white. They might well be the grey area in between. Asking people to look at things from an alternative point of view. And some scaffolding. So perhaps 3 reasons are fairly easy to find, but 5 are more difficult, and coming up with 7 might challenge people. So in the same space of time, depending on processing time, it could be that some people are generating more ideas than others. And so we looked a little bit at critical thinking in this session. One of the tutors mentioned that she uses trailers from films on Netflix, so that learners can go ahead and predict afterwards what happens after this, what you think is going to happen, or how would you react in this situation. And she said these are very good for getting people to use language devices. And even if they weren't using them before, it's quite a natural context for people to develop their language. One of the opportunities that we now have is to develop further a whole range of skills and combinations, and particular thinking that the session, the live session, is only part of what's going on because of all the resources that are around us. And so looking at how learners use their time across the week and the longer learning journey, and providing resources for them, and also throwing over that mantle to the learners to find out things for themselves and contribute It could be in video form, it could be recordings, it could be a shared slide or shared document. We could create hyperdocs, quite a lot of different ways of actually communicating what we found and of logging it. So quite a lot of creative ideas coming out. Tutors using stories and making new connections and using video and audio. We do have now all those possibilities. We looked at storytelling based on short pieces of work and discussed the possibility of putting those into stream, so to create a narrative that happens over the week for learners to read and enjoy. One tutor has joined up with care homes and has encouraged her learners to have pen pals there, so they communicate in real time, in real life, and that has been a successful project. Another tutor has looked at lockdown stories from care homes, and that there is a link to that on the Padlet. We discussed briefly using games and competition, scoring, getting peers to work together and review each other's work or suggest ways of improving things. We didn't really look very closely at this whole aspect, but we did touch on it. And we know that interaction is a great way to bring things forward using games, as long as we're careful about how our learners are feeling. So that brings me on to just looking at what that might mean, how we empower the students or learners. And one of the aspects of that, I think, is to set assignments and challenges that see them as people who are able to do things. So one task, for example, that I set is to be a small business owner, and you brief a website designer. You know, what kind of website would you like? What kind of information should it have? What color scheme should it have? What would the target audience be? Those kind of questions. So assignments where the learner is actually already functioning in a way that perhaps they will in the future. Learner's voice we've looked at in terms of letter writing, but also creating books, joining into book clubs. One of the tutors was saying that she's created a book group which runs fortnightly, and learners work around short stories and they talk about what they've been reading. And that's proved very successful during lockdown and will now meet in centre as well as online. Other areas for looking at voice would be exit tickets and making sure we get reflections from learners as they go through. In my own service, we now have our ILPs online, and they are updated one-to-one with learners on a regular basis. Involving learners in decision making, we discussed the various benefits of this, one of them being that for tutors to provide everything is both unreasonable and practically impossible in terms of workload, but also not particularly good practice when we have learners who can be trained into understanding how to do research and share their work. And the benefits of that would reach way beyond themselves, right out to the group. So we discussed SharePoints in class and also within classroom. So in this session, we didn't look too much at assessment, because I'm going to be running a session next week on assessment for learning. But we did discuss briefly feeding back to learners and the possibilities we have for that by using Google Classroom and by doing one-to-ones, and also helping learners to understand what our shorthand might mean, and then getting them to discuss how they could correct what we've suggested, working together in pairs on that. We we discussed briefly recognizing